Hi, and welcome to Random Rogers Big Picture for the week of June 22nd. Just one real thing on the agenda this week. But first, before I get into it, Friday afternoon, I was watching the end of the Turkey versus Croatia soccer game. It was a fantastic match. And at about 2 o'clock my time, my buddy Roy calls me and says, "Hey, I just saw you on TV. I filmed an ETF tracker the last time I was down in Phoenix to do a thing for CNBC. To not get too carried away, I've only been on there twice, so it's not like I'm on there all the time. But and fortunately, he called in enough time. It was still in my TiVo. People who have TiVo will know what that means, and so I was able to see it. If you didn't see it, I'll give you a very quick recap. Hey, mister, you gotta pay for those donuts. Some of you pop culture people will recognize what that is, but I was seriously on ETF Tracker, which is kind of cool. Anyway, on to this week's topic. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal on Friday talking about a bunch of IPOs from Brazil. The stock market has been, how do you say en fuego in Portuguese, as I'm sure most of you know. And when markets do very well, there tend to be a lot of IPOs. We've all lived through that. We just had that at the beginning of this decade, or maybe more correctly, the end of the last decade. But whatever, you get the point. And so that's normal market behavior. So this article was talking about something that was kind of, and actually I guess we saw the same thing with China, didn't we? But this article was talking about some sort of peculiar lending relationship between the bank that was doing the deal, or banks participating, not just doing individually the deal, and also that involved lending money versus taking an ownership stake. And most of those particular brand of IPOs had not done well. The content of the article is not so much the thing, but it brought up another point about accessing some of these markets that are either, whether you think of them as being hot markets, thematic exposures, or whatever. Something maybe to think about, and this is, I brought this up a while back in terms of, I think I called the post proxification. I was talking about Statoil, which is a client holding, as being a proxy for Norway, but kind of a different spin on that theme, which is, if you buy into top-down management, which obviously I do, then once you have selected the country, that then becomes the bigger determinant as to whether or not you're going to end up being right or wrong. Obviously, you can't say that in absolutes, but most of the time that tends to be the case. Most things China are down. Up until a couple of weeks ago, most things Brazil have been up. I mean, that's fairly simple. It really then just gets into order of magnitude. But in picking a country, now I don't think it really matters which country, but if you're starting from the top down as how do I get into Peru, just as an example with not many choices. If you stray too far away from the biggest companies, then you start to take on, this is going to be obvious, but you start to take on more risk. And if really what you're just trying to do is capture the country, you don't necessarily need to add extra value beyond getting the country selection right, with the trade-off being when you go beyond just taking some big proxy for the country, you end up taking more risk. Some of these Chinese solar plays, there's a bunch of Chinese solar plays, there's a bunch of Chinese broadcasting companies. A lot of them have been hit very hard, and the way these things tend to work, and you can look at, the U.S. from the start of this decade, the S&P 500 down about 50%, at about cut in half. I don't have the exact number off the top of my head. The NASDAQ dropped 75 or 80%, but how many, $100 and $200 billion internet companies dropped 95%, which is, we're talking magnitude, but that is way worse, obviously, than 50. I consider that to be way worse than a 70 or 80% decline, dropping 95%. But either way, you when you start to branch out into kind of the more esoteric things, you start to take on an additional risk other than just if something bad happens with the country, you're just going to go along for the ride for the most part down. Let's go back to Norway as an example. Someone, when Seeking Alpha reran that post, someone picked on me saying, or not picked on me, but just said, well, Yara International, which has an ADRYARIY, would have been a better proxy because it was up a ton. No, it wasn't. It was a better hold. It wasn't a better proxy. So in trying to capture a country, just whatever the country does, Statoil made sense at the time. And I think it still makes sense, but whatever. Yara is not a proxy for Norway. It is done way, way better than, it's kind of a fertilizer play, which is why it's done so well. But it's more of a stock pick than a proxy. And so I think where Yara would fit into the discussion, and I don't own the stock, although I have researched it, where I think Yara fits into the discussion is, okay, if you don't have any exposure to the agriculture theme or the fertilizer theme, if that's how you want to think of it, what is the best way in? Clearly, if you've done any sort of due diligence, the name Yara should have probably popped up on the screen. It's got a very large market cap. It's done well. It's a well-run company. The company itself is a fine company. And if you've bothered to learn about potash, Agrium, I don't know Agrium that well. I've got the seed play, Monsanto. I don't have the fertilizer play, so I don't know it that well. Mosaic. If you've looked at these things, then Yara probably should have popped up on the list. And so in picking, okay, I want fertilizers and the like, is Yara the best proxy? And you either come to the conclusion, yes it is, no it isn't, and you pick the one you think is the best proxy for fertilizer. But it's not a proxy for Norway. And so if fertilizer turns out to be a bubble, which I hate that word, but if it's more expedient to just use that word. If it turns out to be a bubble, then all the stocks are going to go down a lot, including Yara. I mean, there's no great analytical prediction there, but that can happen without necessarily touching Norway's OBX index or having a meaningful impact on Statoil. Circumstantially, it might, but it can happen without it, whereas if bad things happen to the Norwegian economy and the Norwegian stock market, Statoil, I would expect, is going to feel that, and vice versa. If Statoil is the starting point for bad things to the OBX, then I would expect both to go on in lockstep, and that can happen independent of whatever Yara is doing. Hopefully I'm saying that in a way that makes sense, but the further out you go on the risk scale, the further away you get from just making a country pick. In talking about China, I've only ever considered some of the bigger names. I used to own an energy stock. Actually, I owned two of them at different times. I mentioned having 3 names that I'm going back into. Well, they're not very complicated businesses. I'll pick 1, maybe 2 of them. They're not very complicated businesses. They're fairly large in size, and I believe will capture the country. Whatever China does, whether I'm wrong or right with the entry point, and I haven't gone in yet, but whether I'm wrong or right with the entry point, I think that by and large, the 3 that I'm working with to choose from will simply just go along for the ride. Hopefully that makes sense. Have a great weekend.